Hello, my name's Andy Lazur. I'm a water quality specialist with the University of Maryland, and welcome to this Wednesday water webinar focusing on water garden basics. And I'll be presenting an overview of some basic considerations on managing a water garden. And then note that at the end of the webinar, there's a list of resources, links that you can refer to get additional information on some aspects of water gardening and also address any other questions that you have. So let's get started. A couple of things that we're going to talk about are design considerations for a water garden, some of those key features that you need to consider. Water quality, which is so important, particularly if you have fish in your water garden, and also to maintain the desired water clarity so that you can see your plants and fish, etc. And then talk about some of the key management practices. Touching on a few of the items, it's always, good with anything, a project like this is to have a plan. And what do you want from your water garden? What sort of benefits do you want? Do you want to add a nice landscape feature to your backyard or front yard, whatever the case may be? Do you want sound? Do you want the sound of a waterfall, as in the bottom left? Do you want different types of plants to look at? So again, having a plan is really important because that'll guide you in the types of decisions that you'll make. So we'll talk about location, materials, size, depth, some other things. And then we'll also touch a little bit on filtration and aeration, because those are very important to maintain good water quality and that you are enjoying the full benefits of your water garden. So we've all heard this, location, 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 right? So this is true with a water garden as well. And these are ideal locations, full sun or as much sun as possible, preferably a level site so that you're not having a lot of storm runoff that would enter the water feature, because that could bring in sediment and affect your water quality. And then also you obviously have to have the water supply, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And if you're going to have a pump and other types of filtration systems, you're going to need electricity. And then also think about most strategic location in your landscape. Do you want to view it from your house? Say if you have a screened porch or your kitchen window, or do you want it located in a setting that maybe you have a special sitting area in your landscape? And so you want it to be viewed so that you are obviously deriving the benefits of that feature. And then also, one of the beautiful things about water gardens is you can get the reflection off that water and see other features of your landscape. So those are basic considerations that make ideal locations. Now, areas that aren't as desirable certainly are directly under trees, and that's for a couple of reasons. First off, you limit light, and the plants that you're going to be putting into your water garden need light. The other thing is you're going to get a lot of leaf litter entering the water garden, and that creates a lot of issues both with maintenance, but also impacts the water quality. So again, if you're located over, and I've seen many water gardens that have been planted near trees or even directly under trees, and that requires typically towards the fall months of putting in a netting so that the leaves are not actually entering the water. Otherwise, you're adding a lot of maintenance. The lowest spot in your yard is not necessarily the best place. And the reason for that is, again, you can get stormwater entering the water garden, and then that brings in sediment, nutrients, and again, would impact the water quality. So when we look at materials, there's lots of choices here, and this is a great table that looks at the pros and cons of different types of materials, whether it be an earthen pond, a liner, which is very typical. And then also there are these prefabricated fiberglass or plastic water gardens that you just basically buy from the source, and then you drop it into the hole that you've dug that kind of fits that particular form. And then there's concrete. And so again, pros and cons of these things. Some are desirable because they have longevity. That would be the liner, the fiberglass unit, or even the concrete. Earthen situations may be a inexpensive entry, but you typically run into situations with seepage and then unwanted vegetation coming in, things like that. And you really need to have a high clay content. We don't really advise an earthen pond for a water garden, although it's very possible to do so. You just need to understand that what you need, not only to build it, but also it may require a little bit more plant management over the years. So again, many pros and cons here, but lots of choices. Other aspects, design considerations is the size. You really need to think about how will it fit in that landscape? Does it complement the landscape? Then also think about the amount of work that's needed, not only to install the water garden, but also to maintain, okay? So you may not want that, if you don't want to have to do a lot of work around the yard on a water garden, you may try to keep the size a little bit smaller. But again, try to fit it into that landscape. Shapes, again, you have a lot of options there, certainly. But what complements the landscape? Do you have a more formal landscape? You may, in that case, you may want to go into something that has a little bit more geometry to it, whether it be a rectangle or things like that. If it's more of an informal garden, then you can get as creative as you want with various curves, etc. Depth is really important consideration, and the recommended depth is 18 to 24 inches. And the reason for that is that you benefit from being able to see your fish or the plants that you have in the water garden. You reduce the amount of maintenance that's involved. And also you have to think about safety. So if you have little children, you don't want a real deep pond because, in fact, also in some jurisdictions, if you have a water garden, dependent upon the depth, there may be code that requires fencing material around a water garden feature. And then the slope of the bottom of the water garden is relatively flat, or a slight slope to maybe an area, a deep area where you may have your put in a pump if you ever wanted to clean it out, for example. So those are just, again, just some basic design considerations for you to consider. Now, water quality is very important for a lot of reasons, as I mentioned, not only for the quality environment for the fish, but also to attain the desired water clarity so that you can see all the different types of not only fish, but plants that you have in your water garden. And then think about it, if you're focusing on fish and that's one of your key desired features of your water garden, think about that water quality. I mean, they live in it. They excrete in it. It's their environment and you need to maintain it. And so we're going to talk about several things about water quality because it tends to be maybe a little bit more complicated for those that have, are maybe new to a water garden, and it constantly changes too. So we'll talk a little bit more about this in depth. But we need to think about our water. What is our water coming from? And so you have a choice between your well, if you're on a private well, or municipal water. Well water has several advantages in that it's generally free of any sort of disease because it's coming from the groundwater essentially. And so it's filtered and usually at a constant temperature too. Then, the disadvantage, of course, is, if you don't have a well, you don't necessarily have to dig a well just to provide water for your water garden. You can certainly use city water or municipal water. But again, the other thing that you need to think about is if you're adding well water to your either existing garden or new water garden, it comes out of the ground zero in oxygen. So you have to give it time to aerate. And you certainly wouldn't want to put a lot of well water in a fish pond. And then sometimes wells might have some undesirable gases as well. It could be hydrogen sulfide, for example. So always we recommend that you test your well water. You can test it for pH, alkalinity, any sort of copper, lead, whatever the case may be. but it's always nice to start off knowing your water quality. And municipal sources, again, it's probably readily available if you're on a supply. It's generally been filtered, generally a good quality. There are some disadvantages, and that generally is the chlorine in the chlorine byproducts, chloramine that are present. These can be toxic to fish, depending upon the concentration. And so, but again, there is some treatment available for you to basically dechlorinate the water. If you've ever had an aquarium, you know, you can add several drops of a product to remove the chlorine. So other parameters, oxygen, temperature, carbon dioxide, pH, you're probably familiar with. Alkalinity and hardness, you may not be. Ammonia and nitrite, and I'll talk a little bit about phytoplankton. Again, dissolved oxygen, or it's called DO, is very important. It's basically the dissolved oxygen that's in the water. Fish need it, obviously, and it's really, really important for fish. If oxygen levels get low, that can stress the fish. It may not outright kill them, but they can certainly get stressed. Just like we can get stressed, any animal can get stressed if the environment or the nutrition, whatever the case may be, is not adequate. And then you might end up with a fish getting disease or even mortality. It's also important to note that, real simply, colder water holds more oxygen. So typically when we see issues, if there's a water garden or a small pond that doesn't have aeration in it, we tend to see low oxygen situations in the summer months when the water temperature is warmer. Okay, again, it's really important. One of the key aspects of when we see low oxygen, to this bottom bullet here is really important because it's really tempting to overfeed fish. And what happens is that not only are the fish excreting nitrogen and ammonia, things like that, but all that organic matter entering the pond, whether it be feed or leaves, will break down. The bacteria feed on it, and in order to decompose it, they're consuming oxygen. So again, we generally see issues in the summer months. So this is a nice little graph that kind of shows you the typical levels. Obviously a dissolved oxygen of 5 parts per million would be desirable. And if you have oxygen or aeration going on in your pond continuously, then you may not get into low dissolved oxygen situations. But again, we're trying to maintain a desirable range at all times. So aeration is one way to do that, certainly. And basically how the way aeration works is it's increasing the contact of air and water. And basically you're getting oxygen diffusing from the air into the water. So aerators work well if they splash water, for example, or you bubble, if you have a really small bubbler. So there's different choices. You can see on the top left, there's a waterfall there, and you can see that white water on the bottom that's adding oxygen. A lot of contact. This waterfall is going continuously. The upper right has a little bubbler, kind of a pump system in there to not only move water, but to add some oxygen as well. And you may not see it, but there's a waterfall in the kind of upper right of that picture as well. So that's 2 systems this particular water garden had for aeration. And this particular owner, I worked with him very closely, added the lower aerator because he added a lot of fish to his water garden and really needed to maintain higher oxygen levels because of that fish load as well as his feeding load. Okay, so again, it's important to move this aerated water through the entire water garden area for the benefit of the fish. And again, waterfalls can work really well in this, dependent upon the amount of flow and also the amount of splashing. And again, what you're trying to do is increase that contact time of air and water. Even a thin film of water moving, say in the upper parts of this of the waterfall here can aerate a little bit of water. And if you have some plants, for example, in here, they can help oxygenate the water as well. pH you're probably familiar with, scale from 1 to 14. 7 is neutral. Typically, the desired range of pH is in that neutral, say 6 to 8, 8.5. But you will see fluctuations of pH daily, and that's related to the biological activity, not only the plants, the bacteria, and the level of carbon dioxide in the water. But we won't get too technical about it, but just understand that it does fluctuate. In fact, all these water quality parameters can fluctuate daily. So again, you can see here, if pH gets out of that desirable range, it can stress fish. It can slow their growth. It can make them more susceptible to diseases. So trying to keep it in that range is important. And so really to know if you're in that right desirable range, you'd have to have a little pH test, and you can get test strips or little pond kits that can help you with identifying the pH. Now, alkalinity is an important water quality parameter. Most people aren't familiar with it. They may be familiar with hardness, but they are different. Basically, alkalinity is the measure of the bases in the water, the carbonates, bicarbonates, etc. And hardness is basically the amount of calcium and magnesium in the water. But alkalinity and pH and hardness are different. Okay, alkalinity can impact the pH. And so if you have a reasonable alkalinity, say 40 parts per million and higher, that tends to buffer your pH, and you don't see those swings of pH as much. The other thing that's important about alkalinity in water gardens or small ponds is that if you ever needed to treat, if you're trying to treat, say, some algae, whether it be filamentous algae or your excessive phytoplankton, and you're wanting to use some sort of copper compound. Copper is very toxic to fish if you have low alkalinity water. So again, you can test or have your water tested for alkalinity, and you only need to test it once essentially, because it's the measure of the bases in the water, and that's not going to change unless you add different water type supply to it. Now, the pond nitrogen cycle, again, think of your water garden as a miniature ecosystem, and there's a lot of activity going on there. But nitrogen is important because if you have fish, you're feeding those fish, and fish feed is high in nitrogen. Even leaf litter, for example, anything organic is going to have nitrogen in that. And different forms of nitrogen can be toxic to fish. Ammonia and nitrite are toxic to fish. Nitrate is lesser so in fresh water. But what the nice thing about this ecosystem, as I mentioned, is you got beneficial bacteria in the water. And they're actually taking that ammonia, which the fish are releasing, or dying plants releasing ammonia, and they convert it to the less toxic form of nitrate. And then the other thing about that is your plants can uptake both the ammonia, but they particularly also like nitrate as well. And so this is constantly going on here. Bacteria are converting this. The plants are taking up the nutrients, not only nitrogen, but other nutrients as well, kind of keeping things in balance. So this cycle is important. So there is this toxic ammonia, and again, I already mentioned where it comes from, typically from fish due to feed. If you overfeed and you've got floating pellets floating there, it is adding nitrogen and organic matter to the pond unnecessarily. What does it do to fish? Well, it can actually damage the gills, and if the gills aren't working, they're not able to take in oxygen as well. It can certainly slow down their growth, and just again, it's that stress and the cumulative stress if you have other issues as well. And typically, as like we said with dissolved oxygen, we typically see more issues with ammonia in the summer months. Again, warmer water, and also the fish are growing in tend to, if we're going to overfeed, it's probably going to be in those summer months. Obviously, we're trying to keep the levels down as low as possible. The biggest thing here is treatment. How can we treat it? Well, the best thing is prevention. Don't overfeed. Have plenty of plants, for example, okay? The plants will take up those nutrients. And we'll talk more about plants in just a minute. So if you have a biofilter in your water garden, say if you actually buy a unit, and biofilters come in different types of designs. Some use little, what they call bio balls. Some use a kind of a fabric media. And the whole purpose of that is to run water through the filter and allows the bacteria to grow on that surface area of that media, whatever it is. And that beneficial bacteria that I described earlier will convert that ammonia to nitrite and then the nitrate, which is less toxic in freshwater situations. So it takes time. If you're starting up a new pond, or you bought a new biofilter and you're adding it to your water garden, it's going to take time for that bacteria to populate on the biofilter and for it to work. And it may take a week, possibly two, just depends upon the water temperature and the level of bacteria. These bacteria are ubiquitous, they're everywhere. So let's talk about biofiltration. Again, biofiltration is just a fancy term for using aquatic life, in this case, whether it's plants or bacteria, to use up nutrients, to take in nutrients and convert them. And there's several options here. This is just one schematic that's showing where you have a pump here that's taking in the water and it's channeling it, going through a UV filter. Sometimes a UV filter is good because it'll help reduce the amount of phytoplankton, the microscopic green algae that might color your water. If you're trying to maintain clear water, that's one tool that you can use. And then that water then is entering the pond. It's coming in contact with different types of plants, and the plants are taking up the ammonia and also helping to regulate the pH. They're adding oxygen. So again, plants are a wonderful item to consider for your water garden, because not only because of their aesthetic value, but also because of the water quality filtration that they do for you. And then here's just another example, essentially maybe using a waterfall to add oxygen to your water, but also that waterfall is providing some area for beneficial bacteria and maybe even some plants to grow on there to help take out some of the nutrients as well and add oxygen. Plants are very beneficial. Here's just a couple of things that they do for you. I already talked about how they help the fish by removing toxic ammonia. They also remove other contaminants such as metals, copper, for example. So that's a benefit as well. They can also control the amount of planktonic algae or phytoplankton by absorbing the nutrients and kind of keeping the phytoplankton at a more appropriate level to maintain the water clarity. Certainly they increase the biological activity. The roots and the leaves that are in contact with the water provide a great home for bacteria and other organisms to colonate and provide benefit to the water, whether it be snails, worms, whatever the case may be. These are all beneficial. And again, if you have an outdoor pond, you're going to have a lot of different types of organisms that will just populate naturally. And obviously they add oxygen, and that's through photosynthesis. They're taking in carbon dioxide and they're producing oxygen, and they can release a lot. They do respire and do consume oxygen, but they're releasing more than they're actually consuming. And these plants also remove carbon dioxide from water. And as you can see, look at the aesthetic value here. You've got your irises, canna, lilies, and then you have some of these submerged vegetation. This is eelgrass or vallisneria, many types of submerged plants that you can use for your water garden. Just a little bit more on biofiltration. Here's a system that's using plants as the biofilter. And you can kind of see here, I'll show you this right here is essentially the biofilter. This is the water garden. The water is pumped up into this. These plants are floating on a raft. It's called a floating wetland. And the water goes through that. And they're going through that root material. And you can see here the really extensive growth of the roots that are taking up nutrients. So again, there's lots of ways to filter water, but plants are probably going to be the most ideal form of that. But again, depending upon the size of your pond and the amount of fish and the amount of feed that you've got out there, you may have to use a combination of these. But certainly rely on plants to be your primary biofilter. So not to go through this graph, but it gives you an idea. So if you are testing your water and you happen to, get some readings, these are what's optimal for goldfish and koi, which are typically what is stocked into a water garden because of their beautiful colors that they have. Talk a little bit about phytoplankton because this is one of the most frequent questions that I receive about is that their ponds their water garden is too green. They can't really see their fish as they really want to. And so this is the microscopic algae, essentially phytoplankton, and the population of that is often referred to as the bloom, and it's the green color. It's in this case, this is not a water garden. This is actually a fish pond, but you can see the level of green color here. It's almost not like pea soup, but it's a healthy population of phytoplankton, but excessive for a water garden. And again, phytoplankton is again wonderful to a point. It provides benefit. It provides a lot of oxygenation. Provides food for some of the organisms that are in the pond. And again, that oxygen production is really huge for phytoplankton. And again, how do you kind of maintain control to where you have a small population or a light population of phytoplankton, but you get the clarity that is desired in a water garden. And that's basically done by a couple of ways. And that's first off, not overfeeding, being sure that you're not adding other organic matter like leaf litter, which breaks down and feeds algae. You can add a lot of plants, other types of plants to take up the nutrients so that they're not going to phytoplankton. And I already mentioned the UV filter as an option. So this is the other common mistake or challenge that we see about water gardens, and that is the tendency to overfeed. And this is a nice graphic from Oklahoma State that, again, what you're trying to do is find a balance of plants and fish. And this diagram is basically showing that the bulk of your living organisms in your water garden should be plants, okay, and less so of fish. And the reason for that is because, to maintain good health of fish, you have to feed them, but it's again a fine balance. If you have too many fish, the tendency is to add a lot of feed, and then that feed is producing ammonia, it's producing nutrients, and you may get not only some toxic situations, but you're probably also going to be feeding a lot of phytoplankton, which is undesirable. So again, keeping that number of fish down lower, keeping that feeding rate down lower is really one of the most important things that you can do to maintain a healthy balance. So I'm going to wrap up with these maintenance practices. And again, there's probably others to include here, but I pulled out the most important ones here. And that is maintaining the balance of plants and fish. I just talked about that. Again, you want more plants than fish. You want those plants to take up the nutrients to help filter that. Certainly with any sort of filter that you have or a pump, you have to maintain that. If you have a pump, you can put a screen over that so that debris wouldn't clog it up and damage it. If you do have a biofilter, you want to follow the recommended maintenance practices on that. Again, I already talked about leaves and other organic matter. And if whatever plants that you do use, as those plants have leaves that die off, try to remove those. And again, what that is doing is reducing the amount of organic matter and nutrients that are entering the pond. Certainly when you're feeding, again, feed a small amount to maintain health and minimal growth. Rules of thumb vary, but whatever they can eat in just a few minutes time is sometimes can work well. The other thing to do with your fish is just watch them. Obviously, you're going to do that for your enjoyment purposes, but if you notice that they're not feeding, for example, there's something going on there. And so you may want to check your water quality, make sure everything is good there, because that's one of the first things that happens when fish are stressed or they have a disease is they'll stop feeding. We generally recommend do not add any wild fish to your pond or some plants that you see in a pond or something like that. Don't add that to your water garden. You can be bringing in unwanted organisms, some invasives, or even diseases. And then winterizing the garden can be done a lot of different ways. If you have any special tropical plants, obviously you can move those indoors. Fish are not going to feed very much in colder months. In fact, if it's very cold, they won't feed at all. What you can do is just feed them on warm days, but only a small amount. And then if you get ice cover, you're going to want to maintain even a small hole in that ice cover so that your pond, essentially your water garden, can breathe. And you can do that with different types of ice melting devices. So I'm going to close here with some water quality and garden resources here. The second bullet is a list of about 10 different extension programs that have garden resources. And then the bottom bullet is Earthkind Landscaping, which has a whole section on water gardens. I used a little bit of the material in this presentation from that site as well as some others. And again, a wealth of information. I encourage you to look at these resources, check them out wherever you are in your water garden experience, whether you're considering to build one or you've had one for many years. You can learn a lot from these various resources, something that you may have not understood or knew previously that might help you in not only your management of your pond, but your enjoyment.
Thank you.